And the reason is that, at least over the long term, we often assume that you can sort of replicate anything. So the entrepreneur or the factory might get spread thin, but then you could just build another factory and find another entrepreneur. Most large expansions are going to require replicating fixed costs in some way. So like Andres Carnes de Reis, it's true they can have a movie theater and whatever, but that requires them to build a restaurant that's twice as big, which might not be that much cheaper than just having a second restaurant, right? Okay, one example of economies of scale I gave was from Learning by Doing, and Lanier Bankard wrote a paper documenting this in the aircraft industry. In particular, he documented that the economies of scale that you get this learning by doing only lasts for a certain amount of time, and if you stop doing the thing, you start to forget it, or you lose the workers who are skilled at it. And so he looked at this case where over time, initially the number of aircraft the firm was producing was increasing, but then it decreased and then it came back up again. And their costs of production came way down per unit during this time when they were producing a lot because they were learning how to produce much better. But then it started to rise again when they had a lower level of production because they had to maybe lay off the more experienced workers because they didn't have as much for them to do, or they didn't have as much, they didn't have as many, they started to forget because they didn't have as much work and so forth. And their costs came back up again. But then when they got more business, they started to come down again. Okay. So ways that we can measure economies of scale. One simple measure is the ratio of average cost to marginal cost. Because if the average cost is greater than the marginal cost, that basically means that we have economies of scale. That's saying that the marginal cost is dragging the average cost down. If it's less than 1, then we have diseconomies of scale because the marginal cost is above the average cost. And actually, anytime you have a homogeneous production function, the degree of homogeneity is exactly this ratio here. So this is a more general representation of the notion of homogeneity when you don't have a homogeneous production technology. The reason why that's true is that if I multiply my inputs by x, under homogeneous production technology, I multiply the output by k. I multiply by x to the k. And that means that if I were to multiply my output by x, I'd have to multiply by my cost by x to the 1 over k. And so that implies if you just take the derivative of it and then also divide it by x, and you take the ratio of those, you get that the elasticity of scale, the ratio of average to marginal cost, is exactly the degree of homogeneity. When you have multiple outputs, when you're producing different things, you can also talk about economies of scope. So those are things that are cheaper to produce together rather than separately. So one example of that is if you think about Walmart, they sell all this stuff. Why do they sell all this stuff? Because they can sort of share one store, and therefore they can produce sales of consumer electronics, sales of appliances, sales of clothing more cheaply together than separately. Because they use the same store to do it, they use the same trucks that have to come to them to do it, etc. Another example of this is in terms of byproducts. So there's a practice called crop rotation, where you plant one crop one year, another crop the next year, and it's actually more efficient than having the same crop there all the time because one crop produces byproducts that are useful for growing the other crop. So there's a joint economies of scope by producing those two things together. Another example of this comes within a city. So often cities benefit from having both universities and industry in the same city. And the reason is the the industry can gain a lot of things from the university, going to lectures there, drawing on their students, et cetera. And the university can gain from having the businesses there because it gives them feedback about what's going on in the real world, helps them with their research, et cetera. So that's another example of sort of a spillover economy of scope. But there can also be diseconomies of scope. And I think a classic example of this is when there's sort of a clash of cultures. So there is a competition regulatory board in Peru, which is also in charge of intellectual property. And I think that it doesn't work very well to combine the two things together because the basic culture of someone protecting intellectual property is they want to defend the interests of the businesses. They want to make sure that they don't get infringed on and so forth. On the other hand, the culture of a competition policy agency is that they want to make sure that consumers have low prices and that companies are competing intensely. Those are sort of opposite types of goals and opposite types of groups that they're naturally serving. And so putting those two things together can compromise both of their missions because both of them get infected with sort of the ideological spirit of the other and they get very confused about what they're trying to accomplish. And so I don't think it makes a lot of sense to put those together. So often a clash of cultures or a clash of styles of production can make for diseconomies of scope. I think another example of that might be, I'm not so sure that it works that great for universities to have great athletics teams and also be academic because people on the campus start to get a set of values that, oh, I really want to be a great athlete, and that's the way to impress the women there, say. And that actually interferes with them achieving academic excellence. Anyway, we're out of time, so I'll see you guys on Thursday.